The prayer was barely half finished when the dust rose on the horizon, and Anna Bancroft would spend the rest of her life believing that God had not waited for her to say Amen. It was the spring of 1873, and the Kansas plains stretched out around her farmstead like a great golden ocean that had forgotten how to move. The sky above was that particular shade of pale blue that only exists in early April, before the heat comes rolling in from the south and bleaches everything the color of old bone. Anna stood at the edge of her north field with her hands pressed together and her eyes closed, her dark hair pulled back beneath a sun-bleached bonnet, and the words she was speaking were not elegant or rehearsed. They were the words of a woman at the end of her rope, honest and ragged and trembling at the edges. Behind her, the iron plow lay on its side in the dirt like a wounded animal. The wooden handle had cracked clean through at the joint 3 days ago, and the iron blade had shifted loose from its collar, and no amount of wire or prayer or stubborn effort had been able to set it right again. She had tried. Lord, had she tried. Her palms were raw from it, her fingers stiff with the cold of the early mornings, and the full seed bag, 60 pounds of spring wheat and another 30 of barley, sat waiting beside the barn with a patience that felt, on her darkest days, like accusation. It was mid-April. She had 2 weeks before the planting window would close. Anna Bancroft was 28 years old and she had been a widow for 11 months. Her husband, Robert, had died of a fever the previous May, one of those swift and terrible fevers that moved through a man like fire through dry grass, leaving nothing behind but ashes and a 200-acre claim that suddenly felt like a sentence rather than a promise. They had no children. They had the land, the house, the barn, a pair of horses named Chester and Rue, 4 chickens, and a dog called Biscuit who was old and slow and deeply devoted to Anna in the way only old dogs manage. Robert had been a good man, steady and kind, and Anna had loved him in the quiet, settled way of a person who has found their place in the world. His absence had not broken her so much as it had hollowed her out, leaving a woman who still functioned, still rose before dawn and fed the animals and hauled water and mended fences, but who moved through each day with a kind of mechanical grief that had no bottom to it. She had no family nearby. Her parents had died years before in Missouri, and her one sister, Clara, lived in Ohio with a husband and 4 children of her own. There was no money to hire help. There was barely enough money to last through summer if the crop came in. If the crop did not come in, Anna had no clear idea what she would do, and she had trained herself not to think about it directly, the way you train yourself not to look at the sun. The nearest town was Harlan's Creek, 8 miles east along a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained and to powder when it didn't. There was a blacksmith there, a man named Potts who could repair the plow. She knew this. But she also knew that Potts would want payment on delivery, and she had already paid him once this winter for the harness buckles, and the tin box on the kitchen shelf, where she kept her cash held exactly $14.60. The repair would cost at least $6, she estimated, and the thought of spending nearly half of everything she had on a blacksmith bill made her chest tight with something that was not quite panic but lived very close to it. So she had come out to the broken plow on this particular Tuesday morning, in the thin April sunlight, and she had kneeled down in the dirt beside the seed bag, and she had prayed. She was not a woman who prayed loudly or with great ceremony. She had grown up Presbyterian, and the God of her childhood was a quiet and practical God who appreciated brevity. But this morning her prayer had gone on longer than usual, because she found that once she started talking, she could not stop. She told God about Robert. She told him about the cold winter and the cracked windowpane in the kitchen that she had stuffed with rags. She told him about the seed bag, those 90 pounds of hope sitting in the shadow of the barn. She told him she was not asking for anything grand or miraculous. She was just asking for help, for some kind of help. For someone to come along who knew something about iron and plows and the fixing of things that were broken. She was on the last sentence of that prayer, the part where she was trying to think of a proper way to close, when she heard the horse. It was not a familiar sound. The rhythm of hooves on packed dirt was different from Chester's heavy plod or Rue's quick-stepping trot. This was a single horse moving at an easy walk, unhurried, coming from the west along the road that ran past the front of her property. Anna opened her eyes. She did not move immediately. She stayed kneeling for a moment, her hands still loosely clasped, and listened. Biscuit, who had been sleeping in the barn doorway, lifted his gray-muzzled head and thumped his tail once against the wood. Anna stood up, brushed the dirt from her dress, and walked around the side of the barn to look at the road. There was a man on horseback coming up the rise about a quarter-mile out. He was riding a big roan gelding, the kind of horse that had seen hard miles and knew how to carry them. The man himself sat easy in the saddle. The way men do when riding is as natural to them as breathing. He had a bedroll tied behind him and a pair of saddlebags, and he wore a brown canvas duster that had been weathered to the color of the prairie itself. His hat was pulled low against the morning glare. Anna stood at her fence post and watched him come. She was not afraid exactly. She was cautious the way any woman alone on a Kansas farm had learned to be cautious, which meant her eyes were steady on him, and she had already noted that the shotgun was inside the front door, 12 steps away. But there was nothing in his bearing that set her nerves to sparking. He rode the way honest men rode, loose and easy, not hunched, not hurrying. When he was close enough to see her standing at the fence, he touched the brim of his hat. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Anna said. He pulled the roan to a gentle stop. Up close she could see that he was perhaps 30 or 32, with a lean, weathered face and dark eyes that caught the light in a way that made them look almost amber. He had the kind of jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days, and there was a quiet steadiness to him that she noticed the same way you notice that a room has stopped being cold. "I'm heading east," he said, "toward Harlan's Creek. I wonder if you might know the road." "I do," Anna said. "Stay on this road, keep east. You'll hit town in about 2 hours at a walk." He nodded, but he didn't immediately move. His eyes had drifted past her, toward the barn, and she turned slightly to see what he was looking at. The broken plow was visible from here, lying on its side in the north field, which from the road looked like exactly what it was, a piece of equipment that had given up. "Trouble with your plow?" he asked. Anna looked back at him. There was no nosiness in the question. It was the same tone a man might use to ask if it was going to rain. "The handle cracked and the blade collars worked loose," she said. "I've been trying to sort it." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her, then at the plow, then back at her. He seemed to be weighing something internal. "I know ironwork," he said. "Spent 3 years in a smithy in Missouri before the war. I'm not the fastest hand anymore, but I can look at it if you'll have me." Anna studied him for a long moment. The morning light came sideways across the plains, and the wind moved gently through the grass along the fence line, and Biscuit had come around the corner of the barn and was now standing beside her, wagging his tail at the stranger with the kind of slow, trusting certainty that old dogs have. "What's your name?" she asked. "Graham Trask," he said. "Anna Bancroft," she replied. "You're welcome to look at it." He swung down from the roan with the ease of a man whose body had done this 10,000 times, tied the horse to the fence post with a practiced half-hitch, and followed her around the barn to where the broken plow lay waiting. Graham Trask crouched beside it and was quiet for several minutes. He turned the iron blade in his hands, ran his thumb along the collar, examined the joint where the handle had cracked. His hands were large and steady, the hands of a man who had done physical work all his life, and Anna stood back and watched him with something she did not yet have a name for. "Collars cracked through on the back side," he said. "That's why the blade shifted. The handle, this is a clean break. It can be spliced if you've got a piece of hardwood the right length. Do you have a saw and a hammer?" "In the barn," Anna said. "I have a saw and a hammer and a short length of ash from where I repaired the fence last autumn." He looked up at her with a slight lift of his brow. "You repaired the fence yourself?" "I did a lot of things myself," Anna said, and there was no self-pity in it, just plain fact. He nodded, and something in his face shifted just slightly, a small adjustment in the eyes that might have been respect. "I can splice the handle today," he said. "The collar, that needs a forge. But if you've got wire and patience, I can brace it well enough to get you through a planting season. It won't be permanent, but it'll hold." "I only need it to hold for 2 weeks," Anna said. "Then I think we can manage that," Graham said. He worked through the morning. Anna brought him the tools from the barn and stood nearby, not hovering but present, handing him things when he needed them and staying out of his way when he didn't. She heated coffee on the stove and brought him a cup, which he took with a brief nod and drank standing up, already looking at the plow again before the cup was fully lowered. He was not a talkative man by nature, she could see that. He spoke when he had something to say and was otherwise comfortable inside his own silence, which she found, surprisingly, easy to be around. By noon, the handle had been spliced and bound and was solid as it had ever been. By mid-afternoon, the collar had been braced with a double wrapping of heavy wire and a wooden shim that Graham had carved from a scrap of the ash board, and the blade sat true in its collar as though it had never moved at all. Anna stood back and looked at it. The plow that had been lying on its side for 3 days, that had been the center of every anxious thought she'd had since Sunday morning, was upright and serviceable and pointing at the sky like it was ready for work. She felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been pulled tight for a very long time. "It'll hold," Graham said again, the way a doctor says a bone is set, simply and with confidence. "Thank you," Anna said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, softer with feeling. "I don't know what I would have done. The seed needs to go in soon, and She stopped herself. She had not meant to say that much, but Graham was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the plow collar, with quiet assessment, like a man who is calculating what is needed next. "Do you have someone to work the plow?" he asked. "The horses look sound enough." "Chester and Rue are fine," Anna said. "I drove plow last spring with Robert, my husband. He passed last May." A brief silence. The wind moved through the grass. "I'm sorry," Graham said, and he said it the way people say things they actually mean. "I can drive it myself," Anna continued. "I did the south field alone last September. It's hard work, but I'm not afraid of hard work." He studied her for a moment. "I can see that," he said. There was no flattery in it, no performance. It was simply an honest observation, and Anna Bancroft, who had been surrounded for 11 months by the kind of gentle pity that well-meaning neighbors dispense like medicine, found it startling and quietly wonderful to be seen as simply capable. She fed him dinner, because it would have been wrong not to. She made biscuits from the last of the flour and a pot of navy beans with a piece of salt pork, and she set 2 plates on the kitchen table, and they ate. The kitchen was plain and clean, with a wood stove and curtains she'd sewn herself from blue calico, and the afternoon light came through the east window and lay in rectangles on the plank floor. They talked while they ate, carefully at first, in the way of people who are strangers and are still finding where the easy places are. She learned that he was from Abilene, or had been for the past year, working cattle drives up from Texas. Before that, St. Louis, where he'd grown up. Before that, the war, which he mentioned only once, and with the flat brevity of a man who has decided not to give it more space than it already takes. He was 31, he said when she asked. He had no family left to speak of. An older brother had died at Chickamauga. His parents were gone, his mother years before the war, his father shortly after. He said it all without drama, the way you report the weather. "Where are you going?" Anna asked. "When you get to Harlan's Creek." "I'm not sure," Graham said, and there was something honest and a little raw in the admission. "I've been riding drives for 6 years. It's hard work and honest work, but—" he looked out the east window at the fields. "I've been thinking lately about land, about staying somewhere." Anna followed his gaze to the fields. "It's good land here," she said. "Soil, water's reliable from the creek in the north section. Robert said this was some of the finest farmland in the county when we came." "Where did you come from?" "Missouri," she said. "Both of us. We came out in '69. Robert had a dream about wheat." She smiled just slightly, and it changed her face entirely. He was a very stubborn man with his dreams. I always thought that was one of his finest qualities. Graham was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Sounds like a good man. He was, Anna said simply. He was. After dinner, Graham rose and said he ought to be getting on toward Harlan's Creek. He had business there, he said, nothing specific, just the kind of vague business that accumulates when a man has been on the trail for weeks, picking up mail and purchasing supplies. Anna walked him to the fence where the roan was tied, and they stood there for a moment in the late afternoon gold light. "I'm grateful to you, Mr. Trask," she said, "more than I can properly say. It was a morning's work," he said, "nothing more than any man ought to do." But they both knew it had been more than that, and the knowledge of it sat between them briefly, acknowledged without being spoken. He swung up into the saddle. He gathered the reins. He looked down at her with those amber-dark eyes and said, "I hope your crop comes in well, Mrs. Bancroft." "I hope you find what you're looking for," Anna said. He touched his hat brim and turned the roan east. She watched him go until the dust swallowed the shape of him, and then she stood there a little while longer until she felt Biscuit lean his old gray head against her leg and sigh. She turned back to the farm. She had planting to do. She began the north field the next morning at first light, hitching Chester and Rue to the repaired plow and working the long rows with steady, methodical care. The soil turned up dark and rich, that deep black Kansas loam that smelled like something alive, and the repaired plow held exactly as Graham Trask had said it would. She worked from before sunrise until the light ran out, and she ached in every bone and muscle by nightfall, but she ate her supper with something that felt very close to satisfaction. She thought about him more than she expected to. Not in a consuming or desperate way, but in the quiet, returned to way that a person thinks about something that has made an impression. She found herself remembering the steadiness of his hands on the plow collar, the way he had spoken to her about the fence repair without any of the surprise or condescension she was accustomed to from men who could not quite believe a woman alone was keeping a farm running. She thought about what he'd said about looking for land, about wanting to stay somewhere. She wondered if he had found what he was looking for in Harlan's Creek, and whether she would see him again, and she asked herself firmly whether it mattered if she did, and did not come up with a satisfying answer. On the third day of planting, she was working the middle section of the north field when she heard hooves on the road again. She did not let herself hope. She kept walking behind Chester and Rue, watching the furrow open up before the blade, and she waited until she reached the end of the row before she turned to look at the road. It was Graham Trask, on the roan, coming from the east. He stopped at the fence the same way he had before, easy and without ceremony, and called out to her. She looped Chester and Rue's reins over the plow handles and walked across the half-turned field to meet him. "I went to Harlan's Creek," he said. "I figured you had," Anna said. "I spoke to Potts the blacksmith. He had a job for a few weeks. A rancher out north needs a new set of harness hardware, and there's some work I can do for him while I'm here." Anna looked at him. He was looking somewhere just past her at the fields. "I also," he said in a slightly more careful voice, "spoke to the land office about whether there's any available claim near here." The wind moved between them. A meadowlark somewhere in the grass said its 3 bright notes. "Is there?" Anna asked. "There's a 160-acre parcel about a mile north," he said. "Corner of it butts up against your property line. It's been unclaimed since '68. Anna was very still. She was watching his profile, the way he was not quite meeting her eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He turned and looked at her then fully and directly, and she saw that he was a man who was accustomed to being honest even when it was uncomfortable. "Because I'm thinking of claiming it," he said. "And I thought you ought to know since we'd be neighbors. And I thought," he stopped, started again. "I thought you might tell me if there's a reason I shouldn't." Anna held his gaze for a long moment. "There's no reason I can think of," she said. He nodded slowly, a pause. "The Potts job will take 3 weeks," he said. "I'll be in town. But I thought I might come by and help with the planting if you'd have me. It's a 2-person job, really, and you're doing it alone." Anna thought about saying no. She thought about the particular pride she had built up over 11 months of refusing to be a woman who needed saving. She thought about the 90-pound seed bag and the 2-week window, and the way her shoulders had screamed at her for the past 3 nights while she tried to sleep. "I'd be grateful for the help," she said. He came every day for the next 10 days. He would ride out from Harlan's Creek in the morning, work the fields alongside her through the daylight hours, and ride back to town in the evening. He drove the plow while Anna managed the seed bag on the seeding passes, and on the days when the horses needed rest, they worked by hand, she and Graham side by side in the soft spring dirt, and they talked. They talked the way people do when they have work in their hands, not performing, not trying, just telling each other things because the silence is companionable and fills naturally with words. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about her father who had been a school teacher, about learning to read early and reading everything she could find, about the stack of books she kept on the shelf by the kitchen window that she read by lamplight after supper. He told her about the cattle drives, the rivers you crossed in June when the water was high, the way the Texas plains looked at night under a full moon, endless and silver, and how he'd once spent 3 days lost in a fog bank in Oklahoma territory that was so thick he couldn't see his own horse's ears. She laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't produced in months, and she felt it move through her like water through dry ground. She noticed things about him that she filed away without meaning to. The way he always moved Chester and Rue's water bucket to the shade before he tied them. The way he would stop work at noon and sit in the grass at the edge of the field and tip his hat over his eyes and be perfectly still for exactly 20 minutes, and then rise without any apparent urgency and go back to work. The way he listened when she spoke, not waiting for his turn to talk but actually listening, his eyes on her face, and the way his responses made it clear he had heard the words she'd actually said, and not the words he'd expected. He brought her news from town when he came. Little things. The general store had gotten a shipment of calico that was very fine, he'd heard, and the schoolteacher had broken his leg falling off a wagon. He said these things with a slight sideways quality, as though he was leaving them for her to pick up or not as she chose, and she always picked them up, and he always seemed quietly glad. On the last day of planting, they finished the north field in the late afternoon, the final row of barley going in just as the sky was turning pink at the edges. Anna drove the last furrow and turned at the end and looked back at the field, at the whole turned and seeded acreage that lay behind them, and she felt something enormous and private move through her that she could not have put into words without crying. Graham was standing at the fence, rolling down his sleeves, and he was looking at the field too. "It's good work," he said. "It is," Anna said. She walked over to him. They stood side by side at the fence in the last of the evening light, looking at what they'd done together, and it felt in that moment as natural as breathing, as though standing here beside this particular man was a thing she had always been on her way toward. "I filed the claim on Monday," Graham said, "on the north parcel." "I'm glad," Anna said, and she meant it in more ways than she let herself examine. He looked at her, and she felt the looking the way you feel a warm hand on your shoulder. "Mrs. Bancroft," he said, and then stopped. "Anna," she said. Something crossed his face that she could only call a softening. "Anna," he said, "I'd like to—" He paused, seeming to choose his words the way he chose tools, picking up each one and setting it down. "I would like to come calling, properly, if that's something you'd be willing." Anna looked at him for a long time. The pink in the sky had deepened to rose, and the meadowlarks were still singing somewhere out in the grass, and Biscuit was asleep in the barn doorway again, and the whole world seemed to have gone very quiet in a way that felt like waiting. "I think I would be willing," she said. The smile that moved across his face was slow and real, the kind of smile that doesn't know it's being smiled. "Then I'll come Sunday," he said, "if that suits." "Sunday suits," Anna said. He rode back to town in the gathering dusk, and Anna stood at the fence until she couldn't see him any more, and then she stood there a little while longer in the warm spring evening, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time, something tentative and bright and alive, rising up through the grief the way new grass rises through the dead winter grass, inevitable and green. He came on Sunday. He arrived at 11 in the morning with his hair combed and his coat brushed, carrying in his saddlebag a tin of hard candies from the general store and a folded newspaper from 3 weeks ago that he'd found at the post office. Anna met him at the fence in her second-best dress, the blue one with the white collar that she'd been saving for no reason she could clearly name, and they walked down to the creek together, the one that ran along the north edge of her property, where the cottonwoods were just beginning to put out their pale green leaves. They sat on the bank and talked for 3 hours. It was different from talking while working. Without the work in their hands, they were more directly themselves, and the conversation moved in directions that surprised them both. She told him things she hadn't told anyone since Robert died about the night in December when the wind came up so hard she'd been afraid the barn roof would go, and how she'd sat in the kitchen with Biscuit and the lamp and hadn't been afraid of the wind at all. She'd been afraid of the silence underneath it, the silence where another voice should have been. He sat very still and listened, and when she was done, he didn't say the things people usually said. He didn't say she was brave or that Robert was at peace or that time heals. He said, "That kind of silence is the hardest thing I know." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." He told her then about his brother, about Thomas, who had been 2 years older and twice as loud and had gone to war expecting adventure and died at Chickamauga in the mud and the rain, and how Graham had gotten the letter 6 weeks after it happened. He had been working in the smithy in St. Louis, and he had read the letter 3 times standing in the middle of the shop, and then he had gone back to work because he hadn't known what else to do. He had been 20 years old. "You learn to keep going," Anna said. "I didn't know how to do anything else," he said. "I'm not sure that's the same as strength." "I think it might be exactly the same," Anna said. The cottonwood leaves above them flickered in the breeze, making that soft papery sound that cottonwoods make in spring, and the creek moved over the stones below them with its small, constant voice, and Anna Bancroft sat in the afternoon sun beside Graham Trask and felt, with quiet and growing certainty, that she was somewhere she wanted to be. He came calling again the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and then on a Wednesday evening because he had seen something he wanted to tell her. A pair of sandhill cranes that had come down in the field at the north boundary, great gray birds, tall as a man's chest, dancing in the wheat stubble. She had seen sandhill cranes before, but not for years, and they went out together to the field's edge in the evening and watched the birds through the last light until the cranes took off in a long, labored climb that became effortless at altitude, heading north. "My father called them the old ones," Graham said, watching them diminish against the sky. "Mine said they'd been flying the same route since before any of us were born," Anna said, "that they'd still be flying them after." He turned to look at her and she turned to look at him, and they were very close, closer than they'd been before, close enough that she could see the amber lights in his dark eyes, and the moment held itself very still. He didn't move too quickly. He was not a man who moved too quickly. He said, "I find I'm very glad I came up this road," in a voice that was quiet and serious, and she said, "So am I," in a voice that came out barely above a whisper. His hand found hers in the grass between them, and her fingers closed around his, and that was enough for that evening. That was everything for that evening, and it was considerable. May came in warm and steady. Graham filed his claim on the north parcel, and a neighbor, a farmer named Tom Adler, whose property bordered the east side of Graham's new claim, helped him start on a cabin on the land. It was a small, practical structure, a single room with a loft, a good stone chimney, a covered porch that faced south. Graham worked on it in the mornings before coming to Anna's property to help with whatever needed doing, and he worked on it in the evenings after he left her, and the thing rose up from the Kansas prairie with the same steady, unpretentious quality that seemed to characterize everything Graham did. He was at Anna's nearly every day now. There was always work to justify the presence. A fence post that needed resetting, a door hinge that had gone bad, the chicken coop that needed a new roof before the summer storms. But the work was only the container. The real thing was the hours they spent together, working side by side and talking, or sitting in the evenings on Anna's front porch in the pair of wooden chairs that had been there since the day she and Robert moved in, watching the sun go down over the prairie in all its theatrical western glory, the sky running through orange and purple and deep rose before settling into the long blue twilight. She showed him her books. He was a reader, which surprised and delighted her. She had not allowed herself to assume it. He had a worn copy of David Copperfield in his saddlebag, and when she showed him her shelf, which included Dickens, yes, but also Thoreau and Emerson, and a tattered copy of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice that had been her mother's, his face lit up in a way she had not seen it light before. "You read Thoreau," he said, as though this was a remarkable discovery. "I do," she said. "My father sent it to me 2 winters ago before he died. I thought it would be about nature, and it was, but it was about so much else besides." "There's a part," Graham said, setting the book down and looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man reaching for something, where he talks about going to the woods to live deliberately, to not, when he came to die, discover that he had not lived. He paused. "I've thought about that passage a great deal, on the drives, when you're out there under all that sky and you start asking yourself what it is you're actually doing." "What answer did you arrive at?" Anna asked. He looked at her steadily. "That I was looking for something worth staying for," he said. The air between them was full. "And have you found it?" she asked, and the question was soft and careful and brave. "I'm looking at it," Graham said. She felt the color rise in her face and did not look away. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said, and Graham Trask sat in the kitchen chair across from her and looked at her with those quiet, amber eyes, and the lamplight moved between them, and outside the spring night spread out over the Kansas plains in all its vast and starry darkness. There was a night in June when a storm came in from the northwest that no one had anticipated. It announced itself at dusk with a wall of purple-black cloud that ate the horizon, and by full dark it was on them, lightning cracking the sky in great white fractures, thunder that you felt in your teeth, rain coming sideways and hard. Anna had gotten the horses into the barn and secured the chicken coop and was inside with Biscuit, and all her lamps lit, and the shutters latched when she heard someone hammering on her door. She opened it to find Graham, completely soaked through, standing on her porch with water streaming off the brim of his hat. "My cabin's roof isn't finished," he said. "Half of it's open to the sky." She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. He came in, dripping on the kitchen floor, and she got him a dry blanket from the chest and a towel for his hair, and poured the coffee that she'd had on the stove for exactly this kind of night. The storm was enormous outside, throwing itself against the house with a kind of furious personhood, and inside the kitchen was warm and lamplit and small, and Anna sat at the kitchen table and Graham sat across from her, wrapped in her blanket with his wet hair standing up at odd angles, and his hands wrapped around the coffee cup, and she had to look away because looking at him looked like too much, like something she needed to look at more carefully in private later. They talked all night. There was no decision about it. The storm did not relent, and neither of them suggested that he should try to leave. And so they stayed up talking, drinking coffee, and then switching to water when the coffee was gone, and the hours went by in the way hours do when you're not watching them. And somewhere around 3 in the morning Anna was in the middle of telling a long story about a county fair in Missouri when she looked across the table and realized Graham was watching her with an expression that made her heart do something complicated and irreversible. She stopped talking. "What is it?" she said. He set his cup down. He leaned forward slightly. "Anna," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that there's no right answer. There's no answer that will change how I want you to know that regardless of—" He stopped, laughed very quietly at himself, rubbed the back of his neck. I'm generally better at saying things than this. Take your time, she said. He looked at her. I love you, he said. I've known it for a while and I've been trying to find the right way to say it and I've now concluded there isn't one, so I'm just saying it. I love you. I want to keep coming here. I want to be the person you call on when something needs fixing. I want to sit on this porch with you and watch the sun go down and talk about Thoreau and cranes and whatever else needs to be talked about for the rest of my life. I want to. Graham, Anna said. He stopped. I love you too, she said. The storm was still going outside, big and theatrical and entirely indifferent to what was happening in Anna Bancroft's kitchen. But inside, in the warm lamplit room, something settled into place with the quiet finality of a key in a lock. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they stayed like that for a long time while the storm blew itself out over the Kansas prairie. And when the rain finally softened to a hiss and the thunder moved east and the first thin gray light of dawn began to show in the east window, they were both still at the table, still talking, still holding hands, and Anna thought that this was perhaps the finest night she had ever spent in this kitchen, in this house. On this land that Robert had dreamed about and she had held alone for 11 difficult months, and she felt Robert's presence, briefly and without sadness, like a benediction. The summer that followed was the summer Anna Bancroft would return to in memory for the rest of her life as the summer she came back to herself. Not the self she had been before Robert died, that was a different person in a different life, but the person she was becoming in the aftermath, shaped by everything that had happened, and she found that she liked this person. She found that she had opinions and capacities and depths that Robert's illness and death and the long hard winter had put to sleep, and Graham Trask, with his quiet steady presence and his genuine attention, was in the business of waking them up. He finished the cabin roof and moved in properly at the end of June. He planted a kitchen garden and a small stand of winter wheat on his claim, and he borrowed Tom Adler's ox for the heavier breaking work and got 30 acres turned by midsummer. He continued to help Anna with her farm as her partner and her friend and her beau, and the people of Harlan's Creek, who were accustomed to gossip as a form of local entertainment, took a certain satisfied interest in the development. Mrs. Garfield, who ran the general store, told Anna one Saturday afternoon that she thought it was a fine thing, just a very fine thing, and Anna thanked her and bought her calico and did not blush as deeply as she might have 6 weeks before. There were a few people in Harlan's Creek who were not so cheerful about it. Bill Crabtree, who had been a neighbor of Anna's to the south, and who had, in a roundabout and unpleasant way, suggested to her during the previous winter that he would be willing to buy her land for a fair price if she found it too much to manage. The implication being that she should find it too much to manage greeted Graham's presence with a squinting unfriendliness that Anna recognized as the special hostility of a man whose plan has been disrupted. Crabtree was not a dangerous man, just an opportunistic one, and his disapproval was an inconvenience Anna had learned to absorb. One afternoon in July, Crabtree rode up to the fence while Graham was repairing the east section of Anna's boundary fence, and he told Graham in a conversational tone that this land would serve a larger operation better than a widow's 40 acres of wheat. Graham looked at him from where he was crouching at the fence post and said in the same even tone that the land was not for sale. Crabtree said that sometimes things become available whether a person wants them to or not, and Graham stood up then, all 6 feet of him, and looked at Crabtree with an expression that was not threatening but was very clear, and said that if he found any of Anna's fences cut or any of her equipment interfered with, he would be having a different kind of conversation with him. Crabtree rode off, and the matter was not raised again. Anna heard about it from Graham that evening matter-of-factly, the way he told her most things. She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Graham said. "But I'm glad you did," she said. He looked at her across the porch. "Anna, I'm going to ask you something soon," he said. When I have the cabin finished properly and the crop in, I want you to know that's coming so you can be thinking about it." Anna set her mending down in her lap. "I know it's coming," she said. He smiled. "Is that your way of telling me the answer?" "That's my way of telling you I'm thinking about it," she said, and her eyes were dancing, and he laughed the way he sometimes laughed, quietly and from somewhere deep, and the evening light on the porch was golden and warm, and Biscuit was snoring in his usual spot, and the wheat in the north field moved in the evening breeze in long silver waves. He asked her in August. He had been to Harlan's Creek 2 days before and come back with a ring that the jeweler there, a Mr. Hoffman, had made to his specifications. A simple band of silver with a small garnet set in it, red as a cherry, serious and lovely, and not showy. Graham was not the type for showy, and Anna would not have wanted it if he had been. He asked her on a Sunday evening after supper, when they were sitting on the porch in their usual chairs with the last of the summer light going long and horizontal across the fields, and he did it without ceremony, without getting down on one knee, because he later told her his knee had been giving him trouble since he'd fallen from the roan back in June, which made her laugh out loud. He simply turned to her and took her hand and said, "Anna, I want you to be my wife. I want to live on this land with you and work alongside you and grow old alongside you and have everything else, whatever else life is willing to give us. Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring in his hand, the small red garnet catching the last of the evening sun. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Graham." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it for a moment, this new thing on her hand, this small red stone in its silver setting, and she thought about all the roads that had led to this porch, to this evening, to this man. Robert's death, and the long winter, and the broken plow, and the prayer she had not finished before the dust rose on the horizon. She thought about how a life assembles itself, not in a straight line, but in a winding path that only makes sense when you stop and look back at it from where you've arrived. She leaned over and kissed him, which was the first time she had kissed him, which was perhaps overdue, and he kissed her back with a care and warmth that said everything the words had already said and then some. And the sun went down over the Kansas prairie in a blaze of gold and rose, and the fields lay still around them in the warm August evening, and even Biscuit seemed to register the occasion, lifting his gray head and looking at them both with his ancient, liquid eyes. They were married in October. The wedding took place at the little clapboard church in Harlan's Creek on the 14th of October, 1873, on a Saturday that was clear and brilliant with autumn sun. The trees along the creek had gone gold and russet, and the prairie grass was the color of honey, and the sky was that deep October blue that seems to go on forever. Anna wore her mother's ivory dress, which she had kept folded in lavender all the years since her mother's death, and which she had let out at the waist and taken in at the shoulders, and which fit her now as though it had been made for her. She carried a small bunch of late-season prairie flowers, goldenrod and purple aster, tied with a length of blue ribbon. Graham stood at the front of the church in a dark coat he had bought from the Harlan's Creek Mercantile, and looked at her walking down the aisle with an expression that made several women in the congregation reach for their handkerchiefs. Tom Adler stood up beside Graham, and a woman named Martha Jennings, who had befriended Anna the previous winter and had been consistently cheerful about the courtship, stood beside Anna, and the Reverend, a tall, thin man named Bickford who had a kind voice and an excellent memory for Scripture, performed the ceremony with warmth and dignity. When Reverend Bickford said, "You may kiss your bride," Graham kissed her, and the congregation applauded, and Martha Jennings cried openly, and Tom Adler grinned so widely his face looked liable to split, and Harlan's Creek had a wedding to talk about for the rest of the month. They went back to Anna's farm that evening as husband and wife. They had decided, without much discussion, that they would live in Anna's house and Graham would work both properties, and eventually they would decide what to do about the separate claims when they had a clearer sense of the future. For now, Anna's house had a kitchen and a bedroom and a front room and a porch, and Graham's cabin was a single room with a loft, and the choice was straightforward. The first autumn of their marriage was a season of adjustment and revelation, as all first seasons of marriage are. They learned each other in the close and intimate way that living together teaches his habit of rising before her even on the coldest mornings, stoking the stove and putting the coffee on before she came down, so the kitchen was warm. Her habit of reading a page or two of one of her books before sleep, and how he began to ask her what she was reading, and she began to read aloud to him, and it became the nightly ritual of their evenings, her voice and his quiet attention and the lamp between them. The way he wore his boots untied in the mornings until the coffee was done. The way she hummed without noticing while she worked, not any particular song, just a low, steady tone that he told her one evening made the house feel completely different from empty houses, and she looked at him and understood exactly what he meant. Anna's crop had come in well that fall, better than she had dared hope. The north field wheat was solid and full-headed. The barley had done its steady, reliable work, and when she tallied the harvest in November, the numbers were the best she'd seen since the first year she and Robert had planted. She paid off the outstanding account at the general store and restocked the tin box on the kitchen shelf and bought a new lamp for the front room. Graham's 30 acres had given a modest return for a first crop, and they agreed to expand his winter wheat planting in the spring. Crabtree, to his credit or his cowardice, had stopped making any noises about the land. He nodded at Anna when he saw her in town and did not speak of it, and Graham and he maintained a neighbor's courteous silence that suited everyone. Winter came and the prairie went white and still. Anna and Graham were warm. The woodpile was substantial. Graham had spent most of October cutting and stacking cord after cord of wood from a stand of dead cottonwood along the North Creek bank, and the house was never cold, even on the worst nights. They spent the long evenings reading and talking and playing cards, and on the nights when the wind was up and the snow was coming sideways and the whole world outside was nothing but howling white, the kitchen was its own universe, warm and lamplit and complete. Anna had been married to Robert in this house, had lived here through his illness and his death and the long silent winter after, and she thought sometimes about the way the house had two lives now, the life that had happened before and the life that was happening now, and she found that the two lives did not conflict. They coexisted the way layers of paint coexist on a surface, each one complete, each one real, each one part of the whole of what the house was. She told Graham this one evening in January, sitting by the stove with the snow sounding against the window glass. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you feel," he started and then paused. "Is it hard, being here with me when this was also when you and Robert—" "No," she said. "Not hard, I think it's right. I think this is how it should be. A house that has been loved in, that has had life in it, it's only more itself for the living. I'm not replacing anything. I'm adding to it." He reached over and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear with his thumb, a gesture so gentle and so characteristic of him that she felt it move through her entire chest. "He chose well," Graham said, "coming here with you." "He did," she said, "and so did you." He smiled, and she loved his smile, the way it arrived slowly and stayed. In the spring of 1874, Anna discovered she was pregnant. She knew before she told Graham, carrying the knowledge for several days like a found object she was still turning in her hands. She felt it in her body with a certainty that surprised her, this new unmistakable presence, and she thought about it while she went about her days, doing the early spring work, the fence checking and the ground turning and the preparation of the seed bed, and she found that beneath the surprise there was a joy so large and simple it made her slightly dizzy when she let herself look at it directly. She told Graham on a Wednesday evening. She told him in the kitchen, standing at the stove with her back to him, and she turned around and said, "I'm expecting," and watched his face. It was one of the finest things she had ever seen, the moment that information arrived on Graham Trask's face. The stillness, and then the incredulous widening of his eyes, and then a smile that took over his face entirely, the whole quiet landscape of it, and he was out of his chair and across the kitchen, and his arms were around her before she had a chance to register that he was moving. "Anna," he said into her hair. Just her name, just that, but with the whole weight of what it meant behind it. She held on to him and felt him holding on to her and thought that, yes, this is exactly right. This is exactly what she'd asked the heavens for that April morning a year ago, kneeling in the dirt beside the broken plow and the full seed bag. She had asked for help, and help had come in the form of a man on a roan horse who knew ironwork and fixed plows and came calling on Sundays and fell in love with her in a field at dusk watching cranes. And here they were now, in the warm kitchen of their shared life, expecting a child, and the world outside was waking up again in the green and gold of a second spring. "A boy," Graham said, pulling back to look at her. "Do you think?" "I have no idea," Anna said, "but we'll find out." "A boy," he said again, and the certainty and the hope in it made her laugh. The pregnancy was healthy and unremarkable in the best possible way. Anna worked through the spring planting with appropriate modification. Graham took over the plow work entirely. They hired a neighbor's boy named Eddie Bright for some of the heavier labor, and Anna managed the seeding and the kitchen garden and the organizational work that her sharp mind found deeply satisfying. She felt well, stronger in many ways than she'd felt in years, as though the new life she was carrying had given her extra resources to draw on. Graham fussed over her in ways that were endearing and occasionally unnecessary. He wanted her to rest more than she needed to rest. He worried about her carrying the water buckets. He appeared at her elbow at convenient moments when anything heavier than a basket was involved. She took this in with amusement mostly, and occasionally put her hands on his arms and said, "Graham, I'm pregnant, not broken." And he would look slightly abashed and agree, and then appear at her elbow again the next day. "You know," she told Martha Jennings one afternoon when Martha came to visit and caught Graham hovering as Anna carried a pot of beans to the table, "he fixed my plow with his bare hands and braced it with wire and a piece of ash, but he seems to think a pot of beans is going to undo me." Martha laughed until she cried. Graham, hearing this from the kitchen doorway, said with great dignity, "The plow was not carrying a child," and both women laughed harder. The crop that second year was better than the first. Graham had gotten 60 acres of his claim into production alongside Anna's 200, and between them they had a farm that was genuine and growing and capable. They talked about the future in the evenings, about whether to run some cattle in addition to the grain, about the orchard they would plant eventually along the south boundary, about the school that Harlan's Creek was trying to establish now that the town had grown enough to warrant it. They talked about the child. If a boy, they agreed, he would be Thomas Robert Trask, for Graham's brother and Anna's husband. Graham had suggested it himself quietly one evening in June, and Anna had been so moved by it that she'd had to look at the ceiling for a moment before she trusted her voice. "You're sure?" she'd said. "Robert loved this land and built something good," Graham said. "Thomas would have loved this kind of life. It seems right to bring them both forward." "Thomas Robert," Anna said, tasting the sound of it. "Yes." Thomas Robert Trask was born on the 14th of November, 1874, in the bedroom of the farmhouse on the Kansas plains, in the middle of a cold, bright afternoon, with a midwife named Mrs. Holt and Graham holding Anna's hand and Biscuit, who had become deeply anxious about the whole proceeding, lying outside the bedroom door and sighing at intervals. He came into the world with considerable opinion, announcing himself at full volume, and Anna, exhausted and radiant, held him in the crook of her arm and looked at his red, furious, magnificent face, and felt a love so immediate and overwhelming that it was almost frightening, as though her chest had suddenly expanded to contain something larger than her body could reasonably hold. Graham sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at his son for a long time without speaking. His eyes were very bright. "Thomas Robert," he said finally, in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Thomas Robert," Anna confirmed. Graham put one large, careful hand on the baby's head, barely touching, as though he was something precious that might break. The baby's tiny fingers curled toward his father's hand. Graham made a sound in his throat that Anna had never heard from him before, low and undone and full of something that had no word for it, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. Biscuit whined from the other side of the door. Mrs. Holt opened it to let him in, and the old dog padded across the floor and lay down at the foot of the bed with a great exhaling sigh, as though the crisis had finally passed. The months that followed, the first months of Thomas Roberts' life, were among the most demanding and most joyful of Anna's memory. The baby was healthy and loud and interested in everything, and he grew at a pace that seemed almost theatrical, and Anna nursed him and sang to him and carried him in a cloth sling across her front as she worked, so that he could watch the world from the vantage point of his mother's chest. Graham was besotted in the particular, slightly helpless way of new fathers, picking the baby up at every available opportunity, walking him around the kitchen in the evenings when Thomas was fussy, talking to him in that serious, quiet voice as though imparting important information, which Anna found so endlessly charming that she had to frequently redirect her attention. They took Thomas out to the field in the spring of 1875, propped in a basket under the cottonwood tree at the field's edge while his parents worked the first planting of the season. He watched the clouds with the absolute philosophical absorption of a person who has not yet decided clouds aren't important, and Graham would check on him every 2 passes of the plow, crouching by the basket and making faces at his son, until the baby's face broke into the enormous gummy smile that had become, in Graham's assessment, the finest sight on the planet. Anna, watching this from across the field, felt something expand in her chest that had no name, just a warmth, just a fullness, just the sensation of a life that was genuinely and completely her own. Biscuit died that spring. He had been old for a long time, longer than anyone had expected, and he went peacefully one morning in his usual spot at the barn door, curled up as though sleeping, and Anna found him when she came out to do the morning feeding. She sat down beside him in the barn door and stroked his gray head and told him that he was a very good dog and that she had loved him, and then she went in and told Graham, and they buried him at the edge of the north field under a section of fence, post that Graham carved his name on, which was the kind of thing Graham did without being asked. Thomas, who was 6 months old and therefore unaware of the occasion, offered some consoling noises from his basket. "He was here from the beginning," Anna said that evening. "He was the only one who was happy about you that first morning." "Smart dog," Graham said. "The smartest," Anna agreed. The years moved with the particular quality of good years, which is to say they had weight and texture and were never quite fast enough. Thomas learned to walk and to run and to help his father with the chickens, and he was by 4 years old a small, serious boy with Graham's dark eyes and Anna's light in them, a combination that produced a child who appeared to be simultaneously thinking very hard about something and enormously pleased by it. He liked books already, which made Anna ineffably proud, and he liked the horses, and he liked following Graham around the farm with a proprietary air, narrating everything that was happening as though providing commentary to an invisible audience. In the summer of 1877, Anna became pregnant again. "A girl this time," she told Graham, who had learned not to predict. "Or another boy," he said mildly. "A girl," Anna said. "I feel different." She was right. Their daughter arrived in February of 1878, in a storm that was far less alarming than it seemed, and she was named Clara Josephine Trask, for Anna's sister in Ohio and Graham's mother. She came into the world quietly, unlike her brother who had announced himself with conviction, and she lay in Anna's arms with an expression of calm assessment that suggested she was already deciding how she felt about all of this. Thomas, who was 3, was brought in to meet his sister the following morning and stood at the edge of the bed looking at her with an expression of serious deliberation. "She's small," he said. "You were small too once," Anna said. "I don't remember that," Thomas said, and Graham, behind him, caught Anna's eye and pressed his lips together. "You'll remember this," Graham told his son. "This is your sister. She's going to be important to you." Thomas considered this with the gravity of a small person being asked to accept a large fact. Then he said, "Okay," in a tone that conveyed both acceptance and reservation, and went to find the cat. They had acquired a cat the previous year, a gray-striped tomcat of no known origin who had appeared on the porch one October evening and remained. Graham had named him Potts, after the Harlan's Creek blacksmith, which Anna found both puzzling and appropriate. Potts the cat had a healthy disregard for all human sentiment and was an excellent mouser. Clara grew into a person of considerable personality. She was quieter than Thomas, but not shy. She was instead watchful, taking in everything around her and processing it at her own pace before rendering her verdict, which was usually decisive. She had Anna's dark hair and a will that her mother recognized with wry amusement as her own. By the time she was 2, she had her brother completely organized, Thomas being the type of person who responds well to direction from confident, smaller people. And Anna and Graham had many evenings on the porch watching their children at play, with the kind of helpless pleasure that parents know and cannot adequately describe. Graham had built an addition to the house by 1877, a second bedroom for the children, and an expanded kitchen with a proper pantry. He had also broken another 40 acres on his claim and gotten them into production, and the combined farm was now a genuinely substantial operation. They ran a small herd of cattle alongside the grain, which Anna had learned to manage with a competence that surprised even her. They hired steady help in the form of Eddie Bright, who had grown from a neighbor's boy into a capable young man who worked the harvest with them every year. There were harder times, too. The summer of 1879 brought a drought that cracked the south fields and burned the corn and made every day an exercise in careful conservation of water. Graham rode the fence line daily, checking for cattle that had strayed toward the depleted creek, and Anna managed the kitchen with the precision of an accountant, measuring out what they had and making it last. They did not panic, and they did not despair, and when the fall rains finally came in October and the soil drank them up with a sound you could almost hear, they stood together at the edge of the north field in the rain, and Anna lifted her face to the sky with her eyes closed, and Graham stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders. "We're all right," he said. "We're all right," she agreed. There was a letter from Anna's sister Clara in Ohio that year, the real Clara, not the baby Clara, asking if they were well and saying that her youngest had just started school and that Ohio was cold, and her husband's business was doing reasonably. Anna wrote back with characteristic honesty, describing the drought and the recovery, and the children and the farm and Graham, and she sent a small drawing Thomas had made of the horses, which Clara wrote back to say she had put on her mantelpiece. The sisters were not close in the way of sisters who lived nearby, but there was a warmth in their correspondence that sustained them both, the warmth of women who know each other's histories and trust each other's truths. The town of Harlan's Creek grew through the 1870s. A new schoolhouse was built in 1876, and Thomas Trask attended from its first year of operation. He walked the 8 miles each way on fair days with 2 other children from farms along the road, a boy named Lewis Adler, Tom's son, and a girl named Priscilla Hayne, and the 3 of them formed the kind of friendship that forms between children who walk long distances together, regularly, durable and frank, and shaped by the specific intimacy of shared roads. Graham and Anna rode Thomas in by wagon when the weather was bad, and Anna, who had been a schoolteacher's daughter and had always thought about teaching, became one of the school's principal volunteers, supplying books from her own shelf and occasionally teaching the older students herself when the schoolmaster, Mr. Farrell, was ill. Anna had not let herself think about teaching during the hard years. She had been too busy surviving. But now, with the farm stable and Graham steady beside her and the children growing into themselves, she let herself think about the things she loved, and teaching was one of them. The way a child's face changed when something clicked into place, when a word or an idea or a page of a book opened a door in their understanding. She spent 2 mornings a week at the schoolhouse from 1877 onward, and it gave her something that was entirely hers, not the farm's and not the family's but her own, and she was better for it. Graham understood this without being told. He rearranged the farm schedule around her school mornings without comment, and when she came home on those days with the energized look of a person who has been doing exactly what they should be doing, he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since that first April morning on the road, with the quiet attention of a man who finds his companion genuinely interesting, which is perhaps the most sustaining form of love there is. They disagreed sometimes, as real people do. They had real disagreements about the cattle, about money, about how to handle a difficult situation with a neighboring farmer who had let his fence go and whose cattle were consistently getting into their north field. They argued once, genuinely and with heat, about whether to sell 40 acres of Graham's claim to fund an expansion of the house, Anna thinking it was practical and Graham resistant to selling any land with the particular feeling of a man who has made land his anchor. They worked it out over 3 days of edgy conversation and 1 evening of honest, open talking, and they found the third option that neither of them had seen while they were stuck in the binary of the argument, which was to mortgage a portion of the following year's crop against a bank loan to fund the expansion. "You're right that we need the space," Graham said, finally. "You're right that the land matters," Anna said. "We usually manage to both be right," he said, with the slight sideways quality that she had learned was his version of a grin. "We do," she agreed. The expansion was built in 1880 and included a proper study for Anna's books, which had by now overflowed every shelf and surface in the house, and a covered porch that ran the full length of the south face of the building, and 2 additional sleeping spaces for the children, who had been cheerfully cramped but were now at ages where a certain amount of territory mattered. Thomas, at 6, claimed his room with the immediate and total conviction of a person planting a flag. Clara, at 2, was less opinionated about the room itself and more interested in its proximity to the cat, who had taken to sleeping at the foot of her bed. The summer of 1880 brought another event that the family did not anticipate. Graham was working the east field one June afternoon when Tom Adler arrived at the fence in considerable haste, looking for Anna. He had heard from the Harlan's Creek doctor, a man named Pendleton, that there was a young woman at the town's boarding house who had arrived by stage 2 days ago from the east. She was alone. She had been on her way to join a husband who, when she arrived, turned out to not exist as described, a letter-match arrangement that had proven fraudulent, a man who had described himself as a prosperous rancher and was in fact no such thing. The woman was 20, stranded, without resources, and Dr. Pendleton had thought of Anna. Anna went to town that afternoon with Graham beside her in the wagon and met the young woman, whose name was Eliza Ford, a small, scared, red-eyed woman from Pennsylvania who had spent 3 days crying and was now past crying and into the white-faced clarity of someone who has run out of options. Anna sat across from her in the boarding house parlor and did not give her pity. She gave her practical information. "There is a job at the schoolhouse," Anna said. "Mr. Farrell has been talking about a full-time assistant for a year. I can speak to him. It doesn't pay much, but the boarding house will credit you against labor if you help Mrs. Banks with the cooking." Eliza Ford looked at her with the fragile hope of someone who has been disappointed before and is afraid to trust it. "Why would you do this for someone you don't know?" she asked. Anna thought about a morning in April 2 years ago, kneeling in the dirt beside a broken plow. "Because someone did something for me when I needed it," she said, "and I've been looking for ways to pay it forward ever since." Graham, standing at the door of the parlor with his hat in his hands, caught Anna's eye over Eliza's head, and she saw in his face the particular warm expression he reserved for moments when she did something that surprised him, even though she never quite understood why she surprised him. as though after 7 years she had not given him enough information to know what she was capable of. Eliza Ford took the job at the school, and the arrangement with Mrs. Banks, and she was in Harlan's Creek for 2 years before she met and married a widower farmer from 3 counties east named Harold Foss. She sent Anna a letter every Christmas for 20 years after she left. The farm in the fall of 1880 was a different thing entirely from what it had been when Graham first rode up the road and found it with its broken plow and its waiting seed bag. 240 acres between the 2 claims, the house expanded and comfortable, the barn rebuilt larger, a small orchard of apple and pear trees along the south fence that Graham had planted the previous spring, the cattle herd small but steady, the wheat and barley crop reliable. They were not wealthy by any standard, but they were genuinely prosperous in the way that matters most, which is to say they had more than they needed and they'd built it themselves. Tom Adler and his wife came for supper on a Saturday in October, and the 6 of them sat around Anna's table, the children having been fed earlier and now theoretically in bed, and ate roast chicken and sweet potatoes, and talked about the year and about the plans and about the state of the county, which was developing fast enough to be exciting and slow enough to still feel like home. "You two have done something remarkable here," Tom said at one point, looking around the kitchen with its books and its good lamp and its smell of the evening's cooking still in the air. "We had good bones to work with," Graham said. "He means the land," Anna clarified, "and possibly the plow." Graham glanced at her with the expression she loved, the one that was almost a smile and was somehow better for being almost. "The plow helped," he agreed. "Once it was fixed." "Once it was fixed," Anna said. "Yes." Later that night, after the Adlers had gone home and the children were truly asleep and the kitchen was cleaned and quiet, Anna and Graham sat on the long porch in the October night. The air had the crispness of early autumn, sharp and clean, and the stars were enormous overhead. The prairie rolled away from them in all directions, silver-dark, vast and familiar. "Do you remember that morning?" Anna asked. She didn't need to specify which morning. "I was trying to remember," Graham said, "when exactly I knew." "Knew what?" "That I wasn't going to keep going to Harlan's Creek that day, that I was going to stop." Anna looked at him. "I told myself it was just the plow," he said. "That I stopped because I could see something broken and I knew how to fix it. That it was just the useful thing to do." He paused. "But I remember seeing you standing at that fence post, watching me come up the road, and I remember thinking." He stopped. "What?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark prairie. "I thought, there is a woman standing at a fence post watching me come up the road, and she is not afraid but she is careful, and she is alone but she is not defeated, and she has the look of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is not going to set it down just because someone offers to carry it for her." He paused. "I thought that was the most remarkable thing I'd ever seen." Anna was looking at him. She felt the prairie wind move through her hair, lifting it from her shoulders. "I finished my prayer when you stopped at the fence," she said. "I'd been praying for help and I looked up and there you were, and I thought, well, that was quick." He laughed quietly. "I don't know about divine intervention." "I do," Anna said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into the warm, solid weight of him, and they sat together in the October dark, the 2 of them, on the porch of the house that held their children and their books and their life, looking out at the land they had planted and worked and worried over and loved, and the stars above them were the same stars that had been above these plains for 1,000 years and would be above them for 1,000 more, and the night was very full and very quiet. "Are you happy?" Graham asked. He asked it with the same directness he asked everything, without performance, genuinely wanting to know. Anna thought about it the way she thought about important things, not quickly, not dismissively, but with real attention. She thought about the broken plow and the full seed bag and the prayer. She thought about a man on a roan horse coming up the road in the April morning light. She thought about Robert and his dream about wheat and the quiet good man he had been, and the way his memory lived in this house alongside her new life, not as a ghost but as a foundation. She thought about Thomas, asleep in his room with his serious dark eyes and his love of horses. She thought about Clara, with her quiet assessment and her absolute certainty about everything. She thought about the schoolchildren in Harlan's Creek and the books on her shelves and the apple trees along the south fence and the way the wheat looked in the wind. She thought about the man beside her who had stopped on a road he was passing through and fixed what was broken and stayed. "Yes," she said, "I'm happy, Graham, completely." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. She felt his breath in her hair. "Good," he said. "So am I." The years continued as good years do, in the way of things that are well made, not without difficulty, because nothing real is without difficulty, but with a fundamental soundness that held against what came. Thomas grew into a young man of great practical intelligence, who loved the land the way his father did, and who read the way his mother did, and who managed to combine these things into a person of considerable quiet usefulness. Clara grew into a young woman of decisive wit and warm heart, who was going to be a teacher. She had decided by age 10, and no one who knew her doubted it. Graham and Anna grew into each other the way trees planted close together grow, their branches eventually overlapping and intertwined, until it is impossible to see where one ends and the other begins. They were still distinct people. Anna still had opinions and depths that surprised him. Graham still had silences she respected and did not try to fill. But they shared a life so thoroughly that each was thoroughly present in the shape of the other's days, and neither could entirely remember what the days had been without the other, which was not amnesia but love. In the summer of 1882, Anna planted a kitchen garden that included, along with the beans and the squash and the tomatoes, a row of hollyhocks along the south fence that she grew simply because she loved them. They came up tall and extravagant in deep pink and white, and they were the first entirely frivolous thing she had planted on the farm, and Graham looked at them one morning and said, "Those are beautiful," with the voice of a man who means it, and Anna thought that was perhaps the most Kansas thing he had ever said. The orchard fruited for the first time that same summer, not a great harvest, young trees being what they are, but enough for apple butter and a dozen pies, and a cider that Graham and Tom Adler put up with the kind of careful ceremony that men of the plains apply to homemade spirits. Anna let them at it and went back to her books. At the end of the summer of 1882, as the harvest was coming in full and golden and the air had the quality of burnished brass, and the prairie was that extraordinary late summer amber that made the whole world look like it was made of light, Anna Bancroft Trask stood at the edge of the north field, the field she had kneeled beside 9 years ago with her hands clasped and her eyes closed, asking the heavens for help, and she looked at what she had. The wheat stood in tall golden rows, ready for cutting. Beyond the field, the farmhouse was solid and white in the afternoon sun, with the long south porch that Graham had built, and the apple and pear trees making their small orchard along the fence. She could hear Thomas somewhere behind the barn, talking to the horses, and Clara's voice floating out from the kitchen where she was helping with supper. She could hear, just at the edge of hearing, Graham's easy whistle as he worked the far end of the field, the sound he made when he was thinking and his hands were busy. She had a seed bag full of something she hadn't had 9 years ago. Not wheat, not barley, but the kind of abundance that takes years to grow and cannot be measured in bushels. She had this land. She had these children. She had this man, this steady, quiet, true man who had come up her road before she finished asking and had never stopped coming. The sky above the Kansas plains was enormous and clear, the same sky it had always been, but it looked different from here, from this place she had arrived at. It looked like answered prayer. It looked like the kind of sky you can stand under without being afraid. Anna lifted her face to it. The harvest was in on the 20th of September. All hands worked for 4 days straight. Eddie Bright and his younger brother and Tom Adler's boys and Graham and Thomas, who at 8 years old worked with a seriousness that made the men treat him like a small colleague, which he seemed to find correct. Anna and me, Adler and Clara, who was a very determined 4, managed the feeding of this small army with a logistical fluency that kept everyone moving. The grain filled the storage barn beyond what Anna had estimated, and when she did the final tally on the 21st, the numbers looked back at her from the ledger with a settled, comfortable prosperity that she had to read twice. She brought the ledger to Graham that evening on the porch. He looked at the numbers, he looked at her. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "We could put that south acreage back into production next year," he said. "The parcel I rested." "We could," she said. "Or we could buy that breeding pair of mares Tom mentioned." "Or both," Graham said. "Or both," Anna agreed. They looked out at the darkening fields, at the horizon going pink and then rose and then the deep blue of early evening, and the first stars were beginning, and somewhere out in the prairie grass, a coyote said something brief and was answered by another, farther off. "I'm thinking about the spring," Graham said. "What about it?" "I want to expand the south kitchen garden, put in more hollyhocks." Anna turned to look at him. "You want more hollyhocks," she said. He was looking at the sky with complete composure. "I like hollyhocks," he said. She laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder, and his arm came around her, and the coyotes answered each other across the dark prairie, and the stars came out one by one above the Kansas plains in their ancient and reliable pattern, and inside the house their children were settling toward sleep, and the apples were ripening in the young orchard, and the seed was put away for next spring, and the plow stood ready in the barn, whole and sound, ready for whatever the next season would require. And Anna Bancroft Trask, who had once kneeled in the dirt beside a broken plow with a full seed bag in her hands pressed together, asking the heavens for help, sat on her porch in the September evening and felt the whole warm weight of her answered life, and was grateful, and was full, and was home.